There is a flower that empires bled for, and modern gardens have quietly forgotten why. Not because it stopped blooming, not because it lost its color, but because it could never be fully tamed into something predictable enough for industry to control. Before it was reduced to a bouquet sold in plastic sleeves at grocery store checkouts, this plant was currency. It was medicine. It was a symbol so contested that men went to war over which version of it a nation was permitted to claim. Today we call it the rose bush. The people who first cultivated it called it something closer to the flower that remembers blood. This is the story of what was buried beneath its thorns. Welcome to Ancient Food Files. This channel exists to preserve what modern life has quietly discarded, knowledge systems that predate convenience, that predate ownership, that predate the idea that nature must serve a purpose to be allowed to exist. If that matters to you, consider staying, not for growth, not for algorithms, simply so that what we uncover here does not disappear again into silence. Subscribing is not a favor to us, it is an act of preservation. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description. That way, you can verify it yourself. Now, let us open the archive. Long before Europe claimed the rose as its own, the mountains of ancient Persia held wild thickets of a thorn shrub whose blossoms opened for only days at a time, releasing a fragrance so concentrated that traders described it as overwhelming, almost dangerous, in enclosed spaces. Persian texts from the Achaemenid period, dating as far back as the 6th century BCE, describe royal gardens, paradisa, the walled paradises from which the English word paradise ultimately descends, built specifically to cultivate these fragrant shrubs alongside other rare plants. The rose was not decoration in these gardens. It was proof of dominion over nature itself, a demonstration that a king could command even the wild to bloom on his terms. Further west, in the region that would become Damascus, a distinct variety emerged through centuries of careful, deliberate crossbreeding. A rose so fragrant that its petals were pressed for oil rather than simply admired. Villagers who tended these thorn shrubs did not merely grow flowers, they extracted something closer to liquid memory, an oil so concentrated that a single drop could carry the scent of an entire field. The shrub itself grew low and dense, armored in curved thorns along woody canes, producing blossoms in layered whorls of soft, overlapping petals. 5 original petals in the wild ancestor, multiplied many times over through generations of cultivation into the full, rounded blooms we recognize today. They did not need a laboratory to understand that something extraordinary was contained within each petal. What ancient cultivators understood through instinct, we can now describe in mechanism. The rose's thorns are not, technically, true thorns at all. They are prickles, outgrowths of the plant's outer tissue layer, distinct from thorns that grow from deeper wood. This distinction mattered evolutionarily. Prickles could be produced quickly, cheaply, and densely along a cane, offering the plant a highly efficient defense against grazing animals without diverting significant energy from growth or bloom production. The fragrance itself, concentrated most heavily in the damask varieties prized across Persia and later the Ottoman Empire, comes from a compound family called Damascene ones, alongside citronellol and geraniol, volatile molecules that evaporate readily in warm air, which is precisely why the most intense harvesting occurred in the earliest hours of the morning, before the heat of the day dispersed the oils into open air. Beneath the surface, the plant's root system tells a different story of resilience. Once established, a rose shrub can survive drought, disease, and repeated pruning by regenerating vigorously from its root crown, a trait that allowed ancient cultivators to propagate favored varieties for centuries simply by taking cuttings, preserving genetic lines that in some cases persist, essentially unchanged, into the present day. This is not a fragile flower. This is a plant engineered by both nature and human hands to endure. By the height of the Roman Empire, rose cultivation had become an industry of staggering scale. Historical accounts describe entire fields near Praeneste and Paestum in southern Italy dedicated exclusively to rose production, supplying petals for banquets, medicine, and perfume across the empire. The Crusades, beginning in the 11th century, became an unexpected vector for the rose's westward migration. Returning soldiers and traders brought damask rose cuttings from the Levant back into France and England, where the flower was gradually absorbed into medieval monastery gardens, prized both for its fragrance and for its documented medicinal use in treating wounds and digestive ailments. By the 15th century, the rose had become so politically charged in England that it gave its name to a civil war. The House of Lancaster claimed the red rose. The House of York claimed the white, For over 3 decades, the flower functioned as a battlefield symbol, sewn into banners and worn into combat. A plant transformed into the visual shorthand for competing claims to a throne. This was not metaphor. Men died beneath these symbols, and the flower's meaning was written into England's political memory for centuries afterward. And then, slowly, its deeper meaning began to disappear. As rose cultivation industrialized through the 19th and 20th centuries, breeding programs shifted almost entirely toward traits that served commercial floristry: longer vase life, uniform color, thornless stems for easier handling, blooms bred for visual symmetry rather than fragrance or resilience. The damask rose, once cultivated for its intensely concentrated oil, became commercially sidelined in most markets because it could not compete with hybrid tea roses bred specifically for the cut flower trade, roses engineered to survive shipping, refrigeration, and weeks on a shelf, rather than roses bred to carry the fragrance that once made an entire flower worth going to war over. It was not that the old varieties failed, it was that they were inconvenient for an industry built around uniformity, shelf life, and predictable global shipping schedules. A flower once valued for its unrepeatable, overwhelming scent became, in most commercial contexts, nearly scentless, bred instead for a color and shape that could survive a cardboard box. What was lost was not the plant, it was the reason anyone once believed it was sacred. Modern research has begun returning, cautiously, to what ancient cultivators already understood. Studies published through research institutions in Bulgaria's Rose Valley, still the world's largest producer of true damask rose oil, have documented the extraordinary complexity of rose oil's chemical composition, identifying over 200 distinct aromatic compounds in a single distillation, a complexity modern synthetic fragrances have never fully replicated. Separate pharmacological studies have examined rose hip, the fruit left behind after petals fall, confirming what mountain villages across Persia and later the Balkans relied on for centuries: an unusually high concentration of vitamin C, historically used to stave off scurvy during long winters and sea voyages when fresh produce was unavailable. None of this was unknown to the people who once cultivated these plants by hand. It was simply unmeasured. Science, in this case, did not discover anything new. It confirmed, with instruments, what oral and horticultural tradition had already encoded through generations of careful selection. For many cultures that once cultivated roses for practical survival, for vitamin C, for wound treatment, for preserved oils used through long winters, industrialization eventually reframed the flower as purely ornamental. Its practical value forgotten as commercial supply chains made synthetic alternatives cheaper and more convenient. The deeper tradition of home distillation, of rose hip preservation, of cultivating varieties for resilience rather than appearance, faded fastest in regions that urbanized most quickly. Knowledge passed down through generations of women in particular, historically responsible for household preservation and remedies, lost as fewer families maintained the land or time required to carry it forward. What remains today, in gardens that grow roses purely for visual display, is often the aesthetic without the utility, the color and form without the reason it was once considered indispensable. We are entering a period defined by supply chain fragility, soil degradation, and a growing recognition that plants bred exclusively for appearance and shelf life often carry a fraction of the resilience and nutritional value of their wild or heirloom ancestors. The rose bush, a plant that once fed empires with vitamin C through its hips, treated wounds through its oils, and funded economies through its fragrance, is not merely a decorative relic. It is a demonstration of what a single plant can offer when cultivated for substance rather than shelf appeal. It was never waiting to be rediscovered. It was waiting for a generation willing to look past the bloom and back toward the thorn. The knowledge was never lost. It was only set aside, generation by generation, by systems that valued predictability over depth, and shelf life over substance. Somewhere in the terraced valleys of Bulgaria, Turkey, and Iran, damask roses still bloom each spring for only a few precious weeks, harvested in the cold hours before dawn exactly as they were centuries ago. The plant does not require recognition to continue. It never did. It simply persists, thorned, fragrant, and patient, on a timeline indifferent to modern convenience. Nature does not ask for permission to persist. It only asks for patience. If this story mattered to you, consider staying with *ancient food files. Not for growth, for preservation. What we uncover here only survives if someone chooses to remember it.